If you're at all familiar with horror media of the past decade or so, you've likely heard talk of the elevated horror subgenre. While this name is quite reductive to all the horror films that fall outside the classification of elevated, the subgenre is generally used as a shorthand for the particular brand of psychological and thematically dense horror that has been dominating the market as of late. Most people argue the genre began in 2014 with The Babadook and progressed from there, encompassing a variety of movies, including but not limited to It Follows, Get Out, and Hereditary. Elevated horror is defined just as much by what it includes as by what it doesn't. You'd be hard-pressed to find the kind of jump scares, iconic villains, or expendable characters in these films that you might spot in other horror movies, especially slashers. But some recent horror films have been incorporating many of those elements into the framework of elevated horror, and doing so to great effect. In fact, so many amazing horror films have been breaking the conventions of elevated horror lately that it really got me thinking about the state of so-called elevated horror as a whole, and if it's really the future of the horror genre that so many people have framed it to be. So I hope you'll join me today for a slightly shorter than usual video where we'll try to answer, is elevated horror dying? One of my absolute favorite horror movies of last year was Ty West film X, a send-up of classic slashers like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that presented a lot of thought-provoking subtext in between its gory and taboo material. The film tells the story of a couple of friends who rent out what is basically an Airbnb at the house of an old farmer and his wife so they can film a pornographic movie there. But little do they know, the farmer and his wife are secretly crazy murderers. It's a fun movie, and when I first saw it, I didn't look for any deeper meaning because I had been sold on it as a back-to-basics slasher, just a fun time coincidentally made by one of the most prestigious production companies in horror today. But as I distanced from my first watch and saw the movie again on Blu-ray, I began to understand the film was all about its messages, specifically about the human obsession with fame, the connection between horror and pornography, and the process of aging. If the movie was presented in a more clean or abstract style, I have no doubt it would be labeled as elevated horror, but as it stands now, the film appears to be the exact opposite of the elevated style. And X is representative of a wider pattern in modern horror as a whole. Also released last year, Zach Cregger's directorial debut Barbarian, a terrifying film that goes from tense thriller to Evil Dead-inspired gorefest, did basically the same thing as X. The film, like X, has a very prominent message, one about toxic masculinity and red flags in men. On paper, Barbarian might make for a great elevated horror film, but in practice, it's full of jump scares, graphic effects, exaggerated performances, bad character decisions, and all the staples of a movie that we might normally see excluded from the very gatekeepy world of elevated horror. Barbarian and X are indicative of what I think is killing the conventional elevated horror film, if there really was a definition of that in the first place. A type of movie I would call the thoughtful crowd pleaser, mostly because I couldn't think of anything better. Elevated horror grew out of, I think, a very real divide that showed itself amidst horror movies by the early 2010s. A divide between the often thoughtless horror movies that made most of the money, usually but not always your remakes or sequels, and the small art house horror movies that everyone loved but didn't exactly make all the money. People coined the term elevated horror to describe these smaller art house movies that were more focused on their messages than getting audiences in the theater to jump and squirm. These were movies like the already mentioned The Babadook and It Follows, but many films have been retroactively labeled elevated horror, chiefly movies like Suspiria, Suspiria and The Shining, but that's beside the point. What's important is that you had this kind of duality between the perceived smart movies that got all the critical praise and the more mainstream stuff that didn't commonly get that same praise. If that sounds really elitist, it's because it is. But I would say a kind of merging of the two sides occurred very obviously in 2017 with Jordan Peele's seminal horror masterpiece, Get Out. Get Out is a film rooted in its message, artfully directed and revolutionary for horror as a whole, but it's also a really fun movie and something tons of people showed up to see in theaters. It balanced the two sides of horror that had been drawn by many fans, bridging the gap between elevated horror and the mainstream. And so Get Out popularized this idea of the thoughtful crowd pleaser, something I think has been slowly working its way to the front of horror for the past few years. I'd say the other two Jordan Peele films, especially Nope, fall perfectly into this category, along with movies like The Hunt, The Menu, Barbarian, X, the prequel to X Pearl, and many more. Some of you may have noticed that the majority of those movies are from last year, and that might be telling about the state of elevated horror as a whole. 2022 brought us horror movies that people couldn't stop picking apart and talking about, but also they couldn't stop watching them. They were fun movies that people enjoy returning to, reliant on their messages, but definitely not fitting the traditional definition of elevated horror. Not to hate on horror movies often labeled as elevated in nature, I mean, they are some of my absolute favorites, but films like The Witch and Midsommar don't exactly scream rewatchable to most viewers. Even for me, a girl who loves to rewatch weird and abstract horror movies, I'm gonna pick a movie like The Menu over Hereditary for a rewatch 9 times out of 10. And while these thoughtful crowd pleasers were dominating 2022, a few elevated horror movies definitely slipped through the cracks. Chief among them was Alex Garland's Men, a film that is basically the definition of an elevated horror movie and was very much overshadowed by its more accessible peers. I hardly see it talked about today, even though it's a major recent horror film from A24, directed by the guy who made Annihilation and Ex Machina. The trajectory of conversations around Men definitely reminds me of conversations around A24's Lamb from 2021, a movie that seemed, through its trailer alone, so perfectly designed to become a modern elevated horror classic, but then just faded from the public eye almost immediately after it was released. Longtime fans of the channel know that whenever I actually get around to watching that movie, we will do a review of it. But all that being said, I won't act like these two examples are indicative of the end for an entire subgenre, but I think they speak to a very real transition horror is making towards a different kind of film, one that straddles the line between the artistic flair often associated with elevated horror and accessibility to the wider viewing public. I, for one, love movies like Barbarian, X, and Nope that offer a fun time and thoughtful ideas all in a neat horror package. And I hope more films in their vein are released soon, as I'm sure they will be. I mean, the sequel to X is scheduled for this year, and Jordan Peele's next movie has a late 2024 release date. And if these movies are going to be the ones to show audiences who don't often engage with horror that the genre can be fun, entertaining, thematically rich, and not completely tied to scares, then I'm all for it. But I do think it's worth considering if, as studios see both critical and commercial success with these films, elevated horror will remain the dominant force it has for so many years. I, for one, definitely think elevated horror is on the decline, and 2022, while being one of the best years on record for horror, might also prove to be one of the most transformative, marking a major shift to a whole new style that blends both past and present of the horror genre in an interesting way. So, is elevated horror dying? To say yes feels like a bit of an over-exaggeration, but to say no feels like a bit of a lie. To be honest, I think it's just transforming into something new. But I definitely don't have all the answers to this question, so I encourage anyone in the comments below to weigh in on this conversation. This is just something that I had on my mind, and I wanted to share it and spark up a wider discourse about it. If Thank you guys for watching the video. I'm currently hard at work preparing the next one, which will definitely be a good bit longer, probably close to the 1 hour range. So stay tuned for that. As always, if you want to support the channel, get early access to content, gain a bunch of other benefits, and make my life just a little bit easier, I encourage you to head over to Patreon and join a donation tier. Speaking of Patreon, I'm here at the end to shout out all my patrons. I've had a really big increase in patrons lately that I'm extremely thankful for, and now we have 4 patrons in the shout out tier. So special thanks to Grace, Kaya, Joey, and Alex. And still a massive thanks to all patrons not mentioned by name. Your support is literally what keeps this channel going. And if you aren't feeling Patreon, simply liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing to the channel, all of that would be greatly appreciated and would definitely support my channel in the long term. But as always, I've been Ellie, you have been wonderful, and until next time, bye!